Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for another short story discussion. This is a video which will appear in the short story discussion playlist, but also in the story-by-story read-along of Dubliners by James Joyce. The short story in question today, the 11th of this 15-part series, is A Painful Case. So, what we have is a recap, then we will have literary discussion, and then I have but one creative writing note for this short story. So, what happened? James Duffy lives in Chapelizod because he's kind of an old-fashioned Luddite, and not just a little conservative. His house is plain and unadorned, but one evening he sits next to an older woman with her daughter at the rotunda. The daughter is just slightly younger than is Mr. James Duffy, but it is not the daughter that interests him. It is the attention of Mrs. Emily, Emily Sinico that Duffy desires. Her husband is the captain of a ship. Those fellas never home, don't you know? Duffy starts to visit Mrs. Sinico fairly regularly. Mr. Sinico is ostensibly all right with it, thinking that Duffy is trying to win his daughter's hand. But Duffy and Mrs. Sinico speak late into the night by lamplight, and sometimes in the dark when Mrs. Sinico neglects to keep the lamp lit. Duffy lives for these moments. He feels alive, finally. But on one such occasion, Mrs. Sinico grabs his hand and presses it passionately to her cheek. Duffy knows the Rubicon has been crossed, and they have to break things off. He does, however, ask one more time to see her, though he asks that they see each other in public. He doesn't want things to end badly, but he knows that things cannot go on the way they are. He breaks things off, and 4 years go by. In that time, his father dies. In that time, work changes a little bit. One of the minor bosses at his job retires. He buys a little bit more music. Those are things that matter to him. Then, one day in the paper, he reads this: Death of a lady at Sydney Parade. A painful case. Today at the City of Dublin Hospital, the deputy coroner, in the absence of Mr. Leverett, held an inquest on the body of Mrs. Emily Sinico, aged 43 years, who was killed at Sydney Parade Station yesterday evening. The evidence showed that the deceased lady, while attempting to cross the line, was knocked down by the engine of the 10 o'clock slow train from Kingstown, thereby sustaining injuries of the head and right side, which led to her death. James Lennon, driver of the engine, stated that he had been in the employment of the railroad for 15 years. On hearing the guard's whistle, he set the train in motion, and a second or two afterwards brought it to rest in response to loud cries. The train was going slowly. P. Dunn, a railway porter, stated that as the train was about to start, he observed a woman attempting to cross the lines. He ran towards her and shouted, but before he could reach her, she was caught by the buffer of the engine and fell to the ground. A juror: You saw the lady fall. Witness: Yes. Police Sergeant Crawley deposed that when he arrived, he found the deceased lying on the platform apparently dead. He had the body taken to the waiting room pending the arrival of the ambulance. Constable 57E corroborated. Duffy is angry and disgusted until he realizes he's actually lonely. So what do we have here? We have the short story of Mr. Duffy attempting an affair with a woman who is receptive to the affair. And once things start to play out, he realizes what a bad idea it is, abandons the mission, and is abandoned instead. So, what do we have here about Mr. James Duffy? A medieval doctor would have called him saturnine. This is basically saying that he was melancholic. He was someone who did not have the zest for life. He was someone that we would probably describe in today's society as having major depressive symptoms. Someone who is not living his life. This short story, a little bit, is about... Look, I talk a lot on this channel, and I think I've mentioned it several times in this playlist for Dubliners as well. There's something of life in the idea of a spiral. When we are experiencing new things, we are creating this big circle with our day. But as we learn, certain things are more necessary than others, as we learn that certain things are less enjoyable than others, as we learn that certain things take it out of us and other things do not, that circle gets a little smaller, and then a little smaller, and then a little smaller. And if you're a super efficient person in life, you get your circle very small very fast, and it becomes all of just the important things, all of the things that you have to do. You wake up, you get dressed, you go to work, you get something from McDonald's on the way home, and then you retire for the evening until you have to wake up and get ready for work and go to work and buy something from McDonald's on the way home and retire for the evening. Your circle spirals slowly smaller. Mr. James Duffy seems like a very efficient person and realizes how little is absolutely necessary to life until he meets someone with whom he wants to spend some time. He had resigned himself to this small circle of life. He had awakened in Mrs. Sinico the idea that perhaps life offers more than the empty bedroom provided to her by her always absent husband. Once he broke it off, he understood that life could once again become the small, little circle. She could not deal with that. She decided not to keep living in such a small circle. But we have this here on 77, well, it's not 77 in here, but he lived a little distance from his body, regarding his own acts with doubtful side glances. This is why he is able to return to this little life. Now, this is not an idea without precedence. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. Now, may their God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved, blameless, at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is I believe this is a Catholic idea, but it's either Catholic or Protestant. It was difficult for me to tell when looking into it. I couldn't remember, but this is the idea of philosophical separation, that your soul and your body are different things. So we have Mr. James Duffy here acknowledging that his body wants things, but his spirit should know better. So this is already planted in the story before he starts to sort of wriggle his way into this relationship with a married woman and realizes that his soul should know better. This is the idea that we are not our bodies, we are our soul. But that's a very hard thing to live by. Give me 1 second here, I apologize. Yes, so he finds himself sitting next to Mrs. Emily Sinico, What a pity there is such a poor house tonight. It's so hard on people to have to sing to empty benches. He took the remark as an invitation to talk. He was surprised that she seemed so little awkward. While they talked, he tried to fix her permanently in his memory. There have always been simps, don't you know? But this is someone who has lived so long in isolation that when he sees something he finds worth pursuing, he does not immediately recognize it. He does not recognize it as, well, there could be a future here. He recognizes it as, I need to hang on to this. I need to remember this. I need to store this somewhere. That's sad, isn't it? So here's the thing. It's very easy to read this short story and think of Mr. James Duffy as the bad guy. But aren't we all just as flawed as James Duffy is here? He's not going out meaning to cause harm to anyone, and Mrs. Seneco seems absolutely welcoming of his lack of advances, maybe. She takes it upon herself to make the first physical contact, and when he rebuffs and withdraws in a flawed way, sure, but he's not meaning her any harm. He is falling, if we can use these terms, falling victim to his own emotions. And once he withdraws those emotions, she falls victim to her emotions and ends up ending herself. Because let's get into this. This is definitely, when she runs out onto the train tracks, a suicide. She's not stupid. She knows what's going on with a train. People commit suicide by train. Dr. Halpin, assistant house surgeon of the City of Dublin Hospital, stated that the deceased had 2 lower rib fractures and had sustained severe contusions of the right shoulder. The right side of the head had been injured in the fall. The injuries were not sufficient to have caused death in a normal person. Death, in his opinion, had been probably due to shock and sudden failure of the heart's action. Was it a heart attack, or was it heartbreak? She simply had not the will to go on. She had checked out. She was done. She was finished. She did not want to go on anymore. She was falling victim to her emotions in the way that both of them had fallen victim to their emotions earlier. Which brings us to the reaction of Mr. James Duffy as he reads this. He reads of her death. I think it's pretty obvious that he understands that it was a suicide. And he says to himself, "What an end." The whole narrative of her death revolted him, and it revolted him to think that he had ever spoken to her of what he held sacred. So look, it's very easy to judge this man on this reaction. That's not a great place to be, right? To be disgusted by someone for this reason? Certainly, it speaks lowly of James Duffy's emotional intelligence to be angry at someone for something like this. Obviously, it's not a great place to be, but it is his initial reaction. It's very hard to blame people for their initial reaction. News like this falls upon someone, and their initial reaction is simply the firings of neurons in their brain. They don't get to control that. You get to control how you respond outwardly, and you get to control how you internalize the message thereof. But to be angry at someone like this in response in immediacy is not all that strange or unusual. But you have to grow through it. And Mr. Duffy does, doesn't he? We get this moments later. He asked himself what else could he have done. He could not have carried on a comedy of deception with her. There's no reason to blame him for that, right? In just as much as she gets to sort of initiate that physical contact, and it was understandable in the moment that she would, he gets to realize what they were doing is wrong. He could not have lived with her openly, so they could not have lived in good graces of society. Maybe that says more about society than it does about them. Maybe it says more about them than it does society. Who is to say? He had done what seemed to him best. How was he to blame? Now that she was gone, he understood how lonely her life must have been, sitting night after night alone in that room. Mr. James Duffy is saying this while sitting alone in his room. It's strange, the sympathy that many of us are unwilling to lend to ourselves. We can recognize in other people things that must be painful, but we know in our own lives that same emotion, we've just crusted over it. We've decided to compartmentalize it into some other space. We have decided to swallow those emotions and never let them be. His life would be lonely too until he, too, died, ceased to exist, became a memory, if anyone remembered him. This is the moment where, so we have, I think it's understandable to ask whether or not the if anyone remembered him is narrative and aimed towards the reader, or if it is a moment in the thoughts of Mr. James Duffy. It's sort of a statement that is removed from the story a little bit. It does not read quite as past tense as does the rest of the story. It reads as something that smacks you in the face a little bit. But in as much as we are in this paragraph, in the continual thought process of Mr. James Duffy, I think probably this realization is his in this story. These are his thoughts. He realizes my existence will be extinguished with my life. Now, he seems to be a religious man, so probably he doesn't quite think of it in such finite terms, but he realizes that his impact on the human cause will extinguish when he closes his eyes for the last time. That's a hard realization. Is this, as it is titled, a painful case, and it is a story about Mr. James Duffy, what happens to Mr. James Duffy after this story? After that realization? Does he find the strength to go on? Does he find the strength to go on living the life that he is living? Does he find the strength to change? The strength to go on, but in a different way? Or does he assume the same fate as Mrs. Emily Sinico? I think that's the literature to be taken here. I think that is the moment from which we are supposed to learn that Mr. James Duffy does have. So we oftentimes you can say a story belongs to the person who changes. Who changes in this short story? Who changes in this novel? The Shining seems, and I'm only saying this because I'm reading Stephen King right now with Holly on the channel, etc. There's a series for Holly going on. So I'm reading a lot of Stephen King right now. The Shining seems to be Jack's story. The father figure, the guy that goes crazy. It seems to be his figure, and indeed he does change during the course of the events, but probably that story belongs to his son. His son is the one who is forced, or his wife. But I would say his son is the character who is going to change and steals during the course of the novel, but we understand that it's the future that is going to be different for that child. If the short story does belong to the character who changes, Mr. Duffy does not really change in the course of this story, but I think we can understand that he might in the future. So here is the only writing corner talking point that I have for this short story. This short story really does make you wonder, where's the line? When is it too much? When is it too heavy? When is it too melancholy? I am reminded almost immediately of a short story by David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace? Why am I blanking on David Foster Wallace? Called Incarnations of Burned Children. The first time I read that short story, I loved it. Very serious short story. Very serious implications. Most of them don't happen on screen. Very, very serious short story. And I loved it the first time I read it. I haven't read it again. I haven't felt the need. I think short stories like this are a conundrum almost. Now, Incarnations of Burned Children did not change me in the way that this short story threatens to every once in a while. And then I go out in the live world and I look around and realize, yeah, James Duffy probably had a point. But how much is too much? How serious is too serious? Do you want to read this short story again? If there were a little bit more levity, would you want to read this short story again? I argue maybe the levity would make it more readable, but this is probably the fourth or fifth time I've read this short story, so maybe this is right on the precipice. I don't know, you tell me. That is all I have for this short story discussion, the 11th in a 15-part series taking on Dubliners. It will appear in the Dubliners playlist as well as the short story discussions playlist here on the channel. If you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, there is literature on the channel all the time. There's poetry every Monday. I do short story read-alongs. I do the weekly reader once a week, asking a big question about literature and trying to answer it. And there are novel read-alongs, all sorts of things. And I hope to have you back for the next one.